Welcome to the Teaching Company course on free will and determinism. I'll be your guide through one of the most fascinating and important problems in the history of philosophy. The problem of free will and determinism has its roots in the earliest of philosophical texts, and it remains a vexing problem even today. Indeed, much of the work we'll cover in this course is very recent. Over the last 50 years or so, there's been a great deal of good work on the problem of free will in both philosophy and in the sciences. But before we get to the problem of free will, I want to say something more general about philosophy. Philosophy has a reputation for being about extremely rarefied problems that take years to appreciate, that they're so abstruse and esoteric that no normal person could understand them. And I think that there are problems like this in philosophy. For instance, advanced problems in logic and philosophy of language do really require a great deal of study, even to appreciate what the problems are. But for many of the most important philosophical issues, nothing sophisticated like that is required. No large period of training is required, because for many important philosophical issues, common sense is really at the core of the problem. That many philosophical problems really flow from our everyday ways of understanding the world. And I want to illustrate this with two examples from philosophy that don't have much to do with free will at all. So the first example concerns what's called the mind-body problem. And most generally, the question there is, what's the relation between the mind and the body? And on the one hand, intuitively, my mind doesn't seem like a physical object. It doesn't seem like something that is in a particular location that takes up a certain amount of space. It seems like experiences like pain and emotions, they don't seem like physical objects like basketballs. They seem completely different from physical things. So that's one side of the story. Intuitively, it doesn't seem like my mind is a physical thing. On the other hand, common observation, you don't need to do any science to know this, just everyday observation indicates that the mind interacts with physical objects. So every time I staple my finger, it hurts. Now that's a physical event, a bit of metal piercing my tissue, but it causes mental activity. Pain is a mental activity. So the physical event of stapling my finger causes the mental event of pain. Or to take another kind of example, we know that drugs can affect mental processes. So when people take hallucinogenic drugs, it affects what happens in their mind. So in this case, it seems like what we have are physical events that are producing particular kinds of mental events. And so the mind-body problem asks, well, how is this supposed to work? What's the relation between physical objects, including the brain, and our apparently non-physical mind? So our mind doesn't seem physical, and yet it seems to interact in this regular way with physical objects. And so the mind-body problem is, how can we explain this? Two apparent facts. On the one hand, the mind isn't physical. On the other hand, it has this regular interaction with physical objects. How can we explain that? The other problem that I want to mention is a very different kind of problem. And it's the problem, how is the existence of God consistent with the existence of evil? This is known as the problem of evil. In Western culture, it's a common belief that God knows everything, is all good and all powerful. That's something that most of us were raised to believe in the West. It's also a commonplace that very bad things happen, like little bunnies get burned up in forest fires. That's a bad thing, and it seems like there's no particular point in having bunnies get burned up in forest fires. And so you might wonder, why does evil exist if God exists? Because God knows about it, He knows everything, and God is all powerful, so He could get rid of it. And because God is all good, you would think God would want to get rid of it. So this is the problem of evil. Why does God allow evil to exist when He could get rid of it? Now, philosophers have devoted an enormous amount of intellectual effort on both of these problems, trying to solve both of these problems. They're not our problems, so we're not going to talk about how philosophers have tried to solve these problems. But the point I want to make is these problems can be appreciated without any training in philosophy. You don't need to go to Oxford to understand the mind-body problem. And you don't need to go to Harvard to understand the problem of evil. These problems are right there to be uncovered in our everyday ways of thinking about the world. They just flow from the natural things that we already believe. that philosophy brings them forth. It brings forth these kinds of tensions that we have in different ways we think about the world. And the problem of free will, I think, is very much like this. It too has its roots in common sense. And just to give a sort of simple example, obviously the entire course is about free will, so we'll get much more detailed picture here. But let's just take this at a really elementary level. So it seems that at this moment, I could raise my hand or not raise my hand. That seems like a genuinely open possibility. Like I really could do one or the other. And if I do raise my hand, there, I raise my hand. Now, it seems obvious to me that I could have done otherwise. I could have done something else. I could have kept my hand down. That it was possible for me to raise my hand or not raise my hand. That seems about as obvious to me as anything. Intuitively, it just seems so clear that I could raise my hand or not raise my hand. On the other hand, no pun intended, when I think about the world outside myself, it seems like when things happen, there has to be a reason for their happening. So suppose I come home from work one day and find that there was a fire in my kitchen. I'll tell you what I don't think. I don't think, well, that's too bad, but it's probably just a random thing. There's probably no explanation for it. No, I think that there must be some explanation, a problem with the wiring or an electrical surge or lightning, or most likely the kids did it. But I would never think there's no explanation for why there's a fire in my kitchen. I would never think that. More generally, it seems like for any event, anything that happens, there has to be a reason, there has to be an explanation for why it happened. And you might think that this applies just as much to people's decisions and actions as it does to the circulation of our blood. That is really what's at the core of the problem of free will. On the one hand, it seems intuitively compelling that when I do something, I could have done something else. And on the other hand, it seems like we should be able to give an explanation for the reason that anything happens. And those two intuitions, those two views, run up against each other in the problem of free will. The problem of free will arises in many different forms. It arises in major religions with issues about divine predestination. It arises in secular society where we worry about the impact of environment and genetics on criminal behavior. And it arises in science from the beginning of the scientific revolution to the present. As we'll see in later lectures, there's a great deal of dispute about how best to define the notion of free will. That's one of the central issues in the problem of free will and determinism. And one basic definition is that free will is a person's ability to make her own decision without being forced to make that decision. That's a pretty widely accepted version or explanation of what the notion of free will is supposed to be. Let me say a little bit more. Another way of phrasing it, a little more controversial, is that when a person makes a free decision, it will also be true that she could have decided something else. That's another part of the notion of free will. Now, another thing about the notion of free will that's almost universally accepted is that it's critically linked to the notion of moral responsibility. Indeed, the issue of free will is really more accurately dubbed the issue of free will and moral responsibility. The idea is that a person can only be morally responsible for an action if the action came from their free will. So that's why the ideas are so closely linked. As a result, a person can only deserve to be praised or blamed for an action if they chose it freely. That is, if they're morally responsible for it. The notion of moral responsibility itself provides a key constraint on the way philosophers think about trying to give a definition of free will. Because there are lots of different notions of free will that get used. People use the word free will in different ways. People use the word freedom in different ways. Philosophers say, okay, we want to isolate what we're interested in. We are interested in the kind of free will that is presupposed when we hold each other responsible. So we're interested in that kind of free will that is connected with moral responsibility. Determinism claims that everything that happens is an inevitable consequence of what happened before. And this kind of determinism is referred to as causal determinism, because the idea is that everything is caused by what happened before. There are different ways to capture this idea, and let me just give two different ways in this lecture. So One way of putting it is that everything that happens can be explained completely as a result of what happened before it. And this is supposed to stretch back to the beginning of the universe. So what happened first caused what happened next, and so on, right up until now. So let's say, you can think about this from the other direction. Let's say John performed some action. He went to the grocery store. Well, you can say, John went to the grocery store because of something that happened before it, and something that happened before that, and that will stretch back all the way to the beginning of the universe. And so you can say, John had to go to the store at that point. It was causally inevitable, given what happened up until then. A different way to put this, the second way to present the issue, the thesis of determinism, is in terms of what philosophers sometimes call the rollback. So imagine that we could roll back our own universe to January 1st, 1900. So you just roll it, everything go back and start over. Everything the same, January 1st, 1900, everything exactly the same it was at midnight on January 1st, 1900, and you just let the universe run its course again. What determinism says is that it would run exactly the same course. If everything was the same when it started at January 1st, 1900, then everything will be the same all the way up until the present. Now, that might seem kind of unlikely to you, but the root idea of determinism is familiar and really compelling. It's the idea that there has to be a reason for everything. And that was the point of the example of the kitchen fire. You think, well, of course there's a reason why the fire started. You don't think, probably no reason, who knows, it's probably just one of those random things. No, we think that when something happens, there should be an explanation for why it happened. And we seem to think that that applies across the board. And that is what makes the idea of determinism plausible to us. The doctrine itself is extremely old. The ancient Greek philosopher Leucippus, who lived in the 5th century BCE, produced the earliest known statement of the view. We have very little of his writings. We just have a few sentences, and one of those few sentences is, he says, "Nothing happens at random, but everything for a reason and by necessity." And that statement really captures the core idea of determinism. Everything that happens for a reason and by necessity. This issue of free will is connected with a wide range of deep questions in philosophy. So, do we have control over our actions? Seems like in order to have free will, that would mean we'd have control over our actions. If we don't have free will, then we don't have control. Relatedly, how does choice actually occur? What is it to make a decision? How does that process work? A related question that is surprisingly difficult and surprisingly vexed is, well, when we think people make choices, we think that the self makes the choice. But then the question is, what is the nature of the self that makes the choice? What is it that thing is, that is the choice maker? That turns out to be a very difficult question that we'll explore in later lectures. Another different kind of question is, are people morally responsible for their actions? If we find that there's reason to be skeptical about whether free will exists, it seems like that would similarly make us skeptical about whether people really count as morally responsible for their actions. Relatedly, we can ask, should criminals be morally excused if it turns out that their crimes are just an inevitable product of their genes and their environment? And then another question that you might worry about is, well, can anyone really be evil if everything is determined, if we don't have free will? If a person is determined to have the evil character that they do, to have the vicious character that they do their actions really flow from evil, or do we have to excuse their evil in some significant sense? There are three traditional positions concerning free will and determinism, and they can all be described in relation to one statement, the statement, if determinism is true, then we don't have free will. That statement is called a conditional by philosophers because it's a conditional statement because it says, if this one thing is true, conditional on this one thing being true, this other thing is true. And so that statement is, if determinism is true, there's no free will. Philosophers who defend a strong notion of free will are called libertarians. Now, this isn't to be confused with the political philosophy that goes by the same name, libertarians, although the views are perfectly consistent. You could be a libertarian of both varieties, or it could be one kind of libertarian and not the other. In the philosophy of free will, libertarians embrace fully the idea that we have free will in a very robust sense. What they do is they claim that that statement, if determinism is true, then we don't have free will. They reject the second part of the statement. They say we do have free will. They think that it's so obvious and evident to us that we have free will. And they think that that means that determinism has to be false. In fact, what some libertarians maintain is that one of the things we can learn about the universe is by recognizing that we have free will, we can prove that determinism is false. Because if we have free will, it entails that determinism is false. So the conditional statement again says, if determinism is true, then there's no free will. They say, we know we have free will, that means determinism is false. The diametrically opposed position is occupied by philosophers called hard determinists, and they reject the existence of free will. They accept the conditional statement just like the libertarians. They say, yeah, if determinism is true, then we don't have free will. But they say, look, science and every bit of reason we have indicates that determinism is true, and that means that there's no such thing as free will. So they accept the idea that if determinism is true, there's no free will, and they say, we know determinism is true, and that tells us that we don't have free will. They're called hard determinists because they're hard-nosed, no-nonsense philosophers. They're willing to accept the bad news that there's no such thing as free will. The third major position is known as compatibilism. And compatibilists reject the conditional statement altogether. So again, the conditional statement says, if determinism is true, there's no free will. Compatibilists say that's just a confusion to think that. It's a mistake to think that determinism has any direct significance whatsoever for whether or not we have free will. They say determinism is irrelevant to the question of whether we have free will. And so to say, if determinism is true, then there's no free will, is based on a confusion. The problem of free will has several different aspects that are important to distinguish. So one kind of issue that arises in the free will debate concern descriptive questions, that is, questions about what is required to be free and morally responsible. These are descriptive questions because they're supposed to explain what the concept covers. And one way to think about this is that basically all of us have an intuitive understanding of free choice and responsibility. And the task of philosophers working on this project is to characterize this intuitive understanding. So philosophers who work on the descriptive project are trying to figure out what is involved in having free will. So the questions are things like, what is free will? What would we have to be like in order to have free will? And what is required for us to be morally responsible? Those are the kinds of questions that people are interested in when they're working on this descriptive question of what does the concept of free will require? Now you might wonder, why are philosophers interested in this? To see the point of it, think of an analogy. Let's imagine that you are a detective and you are supposed to find the painting The Scream by Edvard Munch. And this painting was stolen several years ago. And you have been given a tip that it's in an old warehouse. And you go to the warehouse to look to see if it's in there. Well, if you didn't know anything about what the painting looked like, if you didn't have a description of the painting, you would have a very hard time finding it. You need to know what the painting looks like in order to go out and find the item that you're trying to get. Similarly, if you want to know whether we have free will, you need to have a description of free will. You need to know what's required in order for us to have free will. You need a description of what's actually entailed by the existence of free will. And then you can go out and try to figure out whether we have it. That project, trying to figure out whether we have what it takes to be free and responsible, once we figure out what it takes to be free and responsible, then we can say, let's take up the substantive issue, the substantive questions. Do we have what it takes? So we might call this the substantive project of free will, where we're asking, do we have the relevant faculties? Do we have the relevant features? Are we constituted in such a way that free will is something that we enjoy? Is it something that's possible for us? Are we really morally responsible? So the descriptive project says, what's required for free will? And the substantive project says, do we have what it takes to meet those requirements? There's a third kind of question, there's a third kind of project here, which we can think of as prescriptive. And in the prescriptive project, what you ask is, whether and how we should change our everyday practices in light of what we discover about free will. So, if we come to think that determinism is true, does that mean that we should stop holding people morally responsible for their actions? Should we stop punishing people? Should we change the way we punish people? Those are prescriptive questions that follow from figuring out whether or not we want to say that we have free will. And with these distinctions in hand between descriptive, substantive, and prescriptive questions, we can now return to those traditional philosophical positions and explain how they divide up on these distinctions. So, libertarians maintain that the proper description of what free will requires is incompatible with determinism. They say that if you figure out what the descriptive story is about what free will involves, you'll realize that it involves determinism being false. But they go on to maintain that our choices conform to this requirement. They maintain that the correct substantive view is that we do have free will. We have what it takes. That's what the libertarian says, that determinism has to be false for us to have free will, and we have free will. So on the prescriptive front, questions about what should we do, should we change our behavior, libertarians say there's no reason to advocate changing our practices of like holding people responsible for their actions, at least on the grounds of free will, because we have everything that we thought we did. We have the kind of free will that we thought was required for moral responsibility, so there's no basis for changing our behavior. Hard determinists agree with libertarians that a proper descriptive account would recognize that free will is incompatible with determinism. They think that, yeah, if you're going to explain what free will requires, you need to appreciate that it requires that determinism is false. But then the hard determinist goes on to maintain that substantively, determinism is true. As a matter of fact, in the world, determinism is true, and that means that we don't have free will. We don't meet the requirements. Now, if you're a hard determinist, that pushes you to face deep and difficult prescriptive questions, because now you're in a position where you say, I was wrong, or we are wrong. We thought there was free will. It turns out there's no such thing as free will. And now you really are faced with the difficult question, how should we respond to this? How should we react? What kinds of changes should we make to the way we treat each other? The third position, compatibilism, maintains that both of the other positions got it wrong from the very start. That the proper descriptive account of free will shows that free will is perfectly consistent with determinism. So, at least when we think about it in terms of determinism and free will, determinism gives no reason to think that we don't have free will, and so there's no reason coming from determinism to think that we need to change our practices, that we need to change the way we treat each other or stop punishing people the way that we do. Compatibilists say none of that needs to be changed. It was all based on a confusion in what the concept of free will requires. So that's an overview of the very basic positions and how they line up on pretty central ways of distinguishing different issues in the problem of free will. And I'd now like to take a moment to provide an overview of the course. The organization of the course is thematic, but for lectures 2 through 11, each theme will be explained as it develops historically. So the first 9 lectures will explore the basic philosophical positions on free will. Lectures 2 through 4 look at 3 different ways that the notion of necessity has been developed in philosophy. Really, the challenge to free will comes from the notion that our actions are necessary in some way. And this has come about in different kinds of ways in different traditions. So one idea is that fate produces our actions. Another idea is that all of our decisions are predestined by God. And those look like they might pose a problem for free will. We'll explore those issues in lectures 2 and 3. But then in lecture 4, we'll look at what's really the central issue in today's way of thinking about free will and necessity, and that is the contemporary notion of causal determinism that we inherit from the sciences. Lectures 5 through 6 will look at libertarian accounts of free will, beginning with the very earliest libertarian accounts from the Greeks up through 20th century versions of the view. On these views, again, the view is that free will is incompatible with determinism and determinism is false. In lectures 7 and 8, we'll look at compatibilist accounts of free will that maintain that it's a confusion to think that there's any kind of incoherence or inconsistency between determinism and free will. And then in the next two lectures, we'll look at the radical views that deny the existence of free will altogether, that maintain the whole thing is just an illusion, that there's no such thing as free will. And then lecture 11 will address some questions that you might already have been worried about by this point in the course. And one of them is, why do people believe in free will at all? I mean, whether it's true or false, whether we have free will or not, why does everybody believe in it? That's one question that philosophers and psychologists have recently become interested in. And a second question is, if a person doesn't believe in free will, does it even make sense for them to sort of decide what to do? Does it make sense for them to deliberate about actions? That's a problem that we'll explore in lecture 11. Now, lectures 5 through 10 offer philosophical perspectives on both descriptive and substantive questions about free will, because they're going to look both at what's required to have free will and do we meet what's required? Do we have what it takes? But to help decide that substantive question, whether we have free will, to give an informed answer to that question, many have consulted the sciences, and the next 4 lectures will present the most important scientific work that bears on whether we have free will. So lecture 12 will consider physics. Contemporary physicists actually disagree. I think a lot of people think that contemporary physics says full on that the world is not determined. The basic behavior of physical particles is indeterministic, but that's actually not the consensus view. There is no consensus on that matter in contemporary physics. People disagree about whether the behavior of the basic constituents of the universe are determined. And we'll look at that debate in a little bit of detail in lecture 12. Lectures 13 and 14 will turn to recent work in neuroscience that bears on free will. Lecture 13 will look at really low-level work on the way neurons respond in certain kinds of decisions. And lecture 14 will look at some surprising work on the timing of decision, on when the brain activity happens for when you're preparing for an action and when people seem to become aware that they're preparing for an action. And it's a surprising set of results there that are a little disturbing. Lecture 15 will turn to contemporary work in psychology, and I'll tell you that the main thrust of this work is that a lot of what happens when we make decisions is not available to conscious awareness. A lot of the influences on our decisions are subconscious or preconscious in some very significant way. The last 9 lectures will turn to the prescriptive questions, to ethical issues that arise from the problem of free will. So that will be the focus in the last 9 lectures. Lectures 16 and 17 will present the most important frameworks in philosophical ethics of questions about what the right thing to do is, and we'll explore how the issue of free will connects to these ways of thinking about how to decide what the right thing to do is. And then in the following 3 lectures, 18 through 20, we'll consider what denying free will would do for our everyday lives, how it would impact our everyday lives. Philosophers have suggested very different possibilities here. Some think it would be terrible, some think it would be great, and some think it wouldn't make any difference at all. So we'll look at those views in lectures 18 through 20. The next 2 lectures will look at what our punishment practices should be ethically in light of problems of free will, whether we should change our punishment practices ethically, and what kinds of punishment practices are actually effective. And then in the last 2 lectures, we'll look at legal implications of the free will debate and considerations of moral responsibility. Lecture 23 will be an in-depth case study of whether psychopaths should be held morally and legally responsible. And then the final lecture will consider the future of moral responsibility in the law and morality, especially in light of recent work in cognitive science. I want to conclude this lecture by being upfront about the goal of the course. I won't try to provide here an answer to the big question of whether we have free will or whether we are morally responsible. These are very old questions, and while philosophers have advanced the debate, the problems are deep. Now, I'm a philosopher, so I actually have views on these things. I wouldn't be a philosopher if it was just some mental exercise like Sudoku. I'd only do philosophy on the plane if that were the case. So I do have views of free will and moral responsibility, but it would be irresponsible of me to pretend that my own views on the matter have special authority when I'm trying to convey the history and breadth of the subject. So my goal is really to get you to appreciate the nature of the problem, various ways that philosophers have tried to address the problem, and then you have to decide for yourself what to think about the problem of free will.